Crippled in battle, the warrior queen faced death until the human slave she despised stepped forward. The plasma blast seared through Queen Astara's shoulder guard, sending molten metal cascading down her azure skin like liquid fire. She stumbled, her warblade clattering against the stone battlements as rebels pressed their advance through the fortress breach. The acrid smell of burning armor mixed with the copper tang of blood, her blood, as it pooled beneath her feet. "My queen!" Commander Typhon's voice cut through the chaos of battle, his own blade carving through 3 rebels before he reached her side. Astara gritted her teeth, forcing herself upright despite the spreading numbness in her left arm. The wound burned with an unnatural heat that seemed to pulse deeper with each heartbeat. Around them, her forces were routing the last of the rebel stronghold, but victory tasted bitter in her mouth. "It's nothing," she growled, though her voice came out rougher than intended. Typhon's scarred face darkened as he examined the wound. The flesh around the plasma burn had taken on a sickly purple hue, veins of corruption spreading outward like poisonous roots. "That's not plasma residue," he said quietly. The transport back to the medical bay felt endless. Astara maintained her composure as her soldiers carried her through the corridors of her flagship, but each step sent fire racing through her nervous system. By the time they reached the sterile white chambers, her vision had begun to blur at the edges. Healer Zeldin emerged from the preparation chamber, his elongated fingers already glowing with diagnostic energy. The Kethmori had served as her chief medical officer for 7 cycles, his species renowned throughout the galaxy for their healing abilities. "Place her on the diagnostic platform," Zeldin commanded, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. The cool metal against her back provided momentary relief as sensors hummed to life around her. Zeldon's glowing touch traced the wound's perimeter, his expression growing increasingly grave. "The weapon was treated with Xerion toxin," he announced after several tense minutes. Commander Typhon stepped forward. "Can you neutralize it?" Zeldon's silence stretched too long. When he finally spoke, his words fell like hammer blows. "The toxin has already bonded with her cellular matrix. It will reach her primary organs within the hour. I cannot reverse the process." Astara's fingers clenched against the platform's edge. She had conquered 17 worlds, commanded fleets that numbered in the thousands, built an empire that stretched across 3 star systems. She would not die from some rebel's poisoned blade. "There must be something," Typhon insisted. "I have exhausted every treatment protocol. The Queen should prepare her succession." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Through the observation window, Astara could see her bridge crew already beginning the whispered conversations that would determine her replacement. Her empire, built through blood and determination, would be carved up among ambitious generals before her body grew cold. Movement in the corner caught her attention. One of the human slaves assigned to medical maintenance had stopped his cleaning duties, his attention fixed on the diagnostic displays. Humans were useful for menial labor. Their primitive biology made them unsuitable for anything requiring intelligence, but this one's posture suggested something different. Alert, focused. The human stepped closer to the observation window, studying the readouts with an intensity that made Astara's skin prickle. His brown hair was longer than regulation allowed for slaves, and his clothes, though standard issue, couldn't quite hide the lean muscle beneath. When he turned toward the viewing panel, their eyes met through the transparent barrier. "You," she called out, her voice hoarse but commanding. All conversation in the medical bay ceased. Typhon's hand dropped to his weapon as the human approached the doorway. "Yes, Your Majesty?" The slave's voice carried none of the submissive tremor she expected. Instead, it held the steady tone of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "What do you see in those readings?" The human's gaze flicked to Healer Zeldin, who had drawn himself up to his full height in obvious displeasure. Then he looked back at Astara, and she saw something in his eyes that sent an unexpected chill down her spine. Professional assessment. "Xerion toxin creates a cascading cellular breakdown by disrupting mitochondrial function," he said calmly. but the progression pattern suggests this particular strain has been modified with a synthetic enzyme that your current medical protocols wouldn't account for. Typhon drew his sidearm. How does a maintenance slave know? Wait. Astara raised her hand, studying the human more carefully. The way he held himself, the clinical precision of his language, the lack of fear in his stance, none of it fit with what she knew of human capabilities. What's your name, slave? Alexander Cross, Your Majesty, and I'm not maintenance. The admission sent a ripple of tension through the room. Zeldon stepped between them, his luminous fingers crackling with indignation. Your Majesty, you cannot seriously consider. What are you? Astara interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's jaw tightened. I'm a surgeon. The revelation hit the room like a plasma charge. Typhon's weapon remained trained on the human, while Zeldon sputtered protests about primitive medical practices and the impossibility of human intelligence. But Astara found herself studying Alexander's hands. They were steady despite the weapon pointed at his chest, clean despite his supposed maintenance duties, and scarred in a pattern she recognized from her own war surgeons, the precise marks left by surgical instruments used under pressure. The burning in her shoulder had spread to her chest now. Each breath came harder than the last, and the diagnostic displays showed her cellular integrity dropping at an alarming rate. In perhaps 30 minutes, she would lose consciousness. In an hour, she would be dead. Her empire would fall to scavengers like General Korath, who even now was probably calculating his odds of seizing control. Everything she had built would crumble, and the humans, the species she had conquered and enslaved, would remain exactly what she had always believed them to be, inferior. Unless she was wrong. You believe you can save me? She asked. Alexander nodded once. I've treated Xerion poisoning before. The synthetic enzyme creates a feedback loop, but there's a way to interrupt it. Your doctor is right that conventional treatments won't work. You need a surgical approach. This is madness, Zeldon protested. Human medical knowledge is centuries behind our own. You would trust your life to this primitive... Astara looked at the diagnostic display, watching her life drain away in real-time data streams. Then she looked at Alexander Cross, this human who stood in her medical bay, speaking of surgical procedures and cellular cascades as if he belonged there. Her species had ruled the galaxy for millennia based on their inherent superiority, but right now, that superiority was offering her nothing but a dignified death. Commander Typhon, she said finally, her voice carrying the absolute authority that had conquered worlds. Stand down. The weapon lowered reluctantly. Alexander Cross, she continued, meeting his steady gaze, save my life. Alexander's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he examined the surgical instruments Zeldon had reluctantly provided. The Kethmori healer stood rigid beside the diagnostic platform, his luminous fingers twitching with barely contained outrage, while Commander Typhon positioned himself where he could observe every movement. I'll need complete access to the wound site, Alexander said, his voice maintaining that same clinical calm that had first caught Astara's attention. The armor plating will have to be removed. Astara's breath caught. The ornate chest piece wasn't merely armor, it was ceremonial, embedded with the conquest markers of every world she'd claimed. More than that, removing it would leave her torso covered only by the thin undergarment that preserved modesty beneath the metal. Absolutely not, Typhon growled. You will work around. Commander. Astara's voice cut through his protest. The toxin had reached her diaphragm now, making each word an effort, but her authority remained absolute. Comply with his requirements. The magnetic seals released with soft hisses, and Alexander's hands guided the armor away from her shoulder. His touch was impersonal, professional, but Astara felt her skin respond to the contact in ways that had nothing to do with medical necessity. When had anyone last touched her without ceremony or deference? The synthetic enzyme has created microclots throughout your lymphatic system, Alexander explained as he cleaned the wound site. Standard antitoxin protocols would normally flush these out, but this particular modification makes them resistant. They're actually feeding off the treatment attempts. His fingers traced the purple veins spreading across her collarbone, and Astara fought to keep her breathing steady. The touch should have felt clinical, distant. Instead, each point of contact sent electricity through her that had nothing to do with nerve damage. "How do you interrupt it?" she managed. "Surgical embolectomy. I need to physically extract the clots before they reach your heart." Alexander's eyes met hers, and she saw the gravity there. "It's delicate work. One wrong move could cause a massive embolism." Zeldin stepped forward, his voice sharp with accusation. "You're describing a procedure that requires neural mapping capabilities beyond human comprehension. The Xerion toxin affects subdermal nerve clusters in patterns your primitive brain cannot process." "Actually," Alexander said quietly, preparing a local anesthetic, "human hands have greater tactile sensitivity than most species. We can feel variations in tissue density that your instruments might miss." He pressed the injector against her shoulder. The coolness spread through her skin, but it couldn't numb the awareness of his proximity. Astara found herself studying his face as he worked. The concentration in his dark eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he moved with absolute confidence despite the weapon trained on his back. "You've done this before," she observed. "3 times, all combat situations." His hands stilled for a moment. "All successful extractions." "Where?" Alexander's hesitation lasted only seconds, but she caught it. "Field hospitals, during conflicts." The implication hung between them. This human had treated soldiers wounded by her forces, saved lives that her empire had tried to end. The irony would have been amusing if her survival didn't depend on those same skilled hands. "Begin," she commanded. The first incision was precise, controlled. Alexander's fingers worked beneath her skin with a delicacy that surprised her. She had expected human clumsiness, crude attempts at surgical technique. Instead, his movements held the fluid grace of true expertise. "The clots are more extensive than I initially thought," he murmured, his breath warm against her shoulder as he leaned closer. "I need to work deeper into the lymphatic network." His hand slipped beneath the edge of her undergarment, fingers splaying across her ribs to map the toxin's progression. The contact sent heat racing through her core, and Astara bit back a gasp that had nothing to do with surgical discomfort. "Your Majesty," Typhon's voice carried warning, "perhaps we should reconsider." "No." The word came out more forcefully than she intended. Alexander's ministrations had found a cluster of toxin-laden tissue, and his careful extraction sent relief flooding through her system. For the first time since the battle, the burning in her chest began to ease. "That's the primary blockage," Alexander said, depositing the extracted material into a containment field. "But there are smaller clots deeper in the system. I need to access the thoracic cavity." Astara's pulse quickened as she understood what he was asking. Complete exposure, her defenses stripped away, her life placed entirely in the hands of someone her species considered barely sentient. She had conquered worlds through calculated risks. This was perhaps the greatest gamble of her life. "Do it!" The remaining barriers fell away under Alexander's careful ministrations. Cool air touched her bare skin, but his hands provided warmth as they traced the toxin's path with surgical precision. Each touch was necessary, medical, but Astara found herself responding to the intimacy of complete vulnerability. "Your physiology is fascinating," Alexander murmured as he worked. "The cellular regeneration rate is at least 3 times faster than human normal. No wonder your species dominates the galaxy." There was no mockery in his voice, no hidden resentment, just genuine scientific appreciation that made something tighten in Astara's chest. "Yet here you are saving my life," she whispered. His hands paused against her ribs. Lives are worth saving, regardless of species. The simple statement carried weight that settled deep in her consciousness. When had anyone spoken to her about worth that wasn't tied to conquest or dominion? When had anyone treated her as simply someone who deserved to live? "There," Alexander said finally, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction, "the last of the synthetic enzyme clusters. Your natural healing should handle any residual toxin." Already, Astara could feel strength returning to her limbs. The burning had faded to a dull ache, and her breathing came easier. On the diagnostic displays, her cellular integrity readings climbed steadily back toward normal ranges. Zeldon stared at the displays in obvious disbelief. How is this possible? The human methods should have failed. They lack the sophistication to... Sometimes, Alexander interrupted gently, different doesn't mean inferior. It just means different. As he cleaned the surgical site and began applying regenerative bandages, Astara studied this human who had just preserved her empire with nothing more than skill and steady hands. His touch remained professional, but she caught him glancing at her face, checking for signs of pain or discomfort, with a concern that seemed genuinely personal. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why what? Why save me? Your people have every reason to want me dead." Alexander's hands stilled against her shoulder. When he looked at her, his expression held depths she hadn't expected to find in human eyes. "Because you trusted me to try," he said simply. The words hit her with unexpected force. Trust. When had she last truly trusted anyone? Her generals followed orders, her advisors offered counsel based on personal agenda, her subjects obeyed from fear. But this human, this slave she had dismissed as primitive, had earned something she rarely gave. "The procedure is complete, Your Majesty," Alexander said, stepping back to allow Typhon to help her sit upright. "You should experience full recovery within a few hours." As Astara tested her restored mobility, flexing fingers that no longer trembled, she caught Alexander's eye once more. Something had shifted between them during those intimate minutes of medical crisis. The barrier of species superiority had developed cracks that let unexpected light through. "Commander Typhon," she said, her voice regaining its customary authority. "Assign Alexander Cross to my personal medical staff. He is no longer maintenance." "Your Majesty, the other slaves will question." "Let them question. I've seen what human hands can accomplish." As Alexander gathered the surgical instruments, Astara noticed the way he moved, economical, precise, confident. These weren't the movements of someone accustomed to servitude. They were the movements of someone who had commanded respect in his own right. Who exactly was Alexander Cross, and what else about human capabilities had her empire gotten wrong? 3 days of recovery had transformed Astara's private quarters into an unexpected sanctuary. The sterile medical bay had been abandoned in favor of her personal chambers, where Alexander monitored her progress with the same quiet competence that had saved her life. Each morning brought him to her bedside for status checks, each evening for medication adjustments that no longer felt strictly necessary. "Your cellular regeneration is remarkable," Alexander said, examining the nearly invisible scar where the toxin had entered. His fingers traced the healed skin with professional detachment, but Astara caught the way his touch lingered just a fraction longer than required. "Kethmori healing is advanced, but this recovery rate exceeds even their projections." Astara shifted beneath the silk coverings, acutely aware of how the thin fabric revealed the contours of her body. "Perhaps it's the quality of care I've received." Their eyes met, and she saw something flicker in his expression before he turned back to his medical scanner. These moments had become increasingly charged over the past days. Conversations that began with medical necessity, but evolved into something far more personal. "Tell me about your training," she said, settling back against the cushions that supported her still tender shoulder. Alexander's hands stilled on the diagnostic equipment. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. How does a human acquire surgical skills that surpass my own medical staff?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Astara had noticed how Alexander deflected inquiries about his background, offering technical explanations without personal context. But the privacy of her chambers, the intimacy of their daily interactions, had worn down his professional distance. "I studied at the Terra Medical Consortium," he said finally, "specialized in trauma surgery and xenobiology. My research focused on cross-species medical compatibility." "Research?" Astara propped herself up on one elbow, studying his profile. "You were a scientist, not just a surgeon." "Both. Medicine and research often overlap when you're dealing with unknown physiologies." Alexander's voice carried a note of pride that he quickly suppressed. "I published several papers on adaptive surgical techniques." The revelation sent unexpected warmth through Astara's chest. This wasn't just skilled labor, this was intellectual achievement that rivaled her own academic advisors. She had been saved by someone whose mind matched her general's strategic capabilities. What happened to your research? Alexander's jaw tightened. It ended when your forces captured the hospital ship where I was stationed. The words fell between them with quiet weight. Astara had ordered the seizure of that vessel personally, viewing it as a strategic target that supported enemy forces. She had never considered the individual lives caught in that military decision. You were treating soldiers wounded fighting my empire, she said quietly. Among others, the ship served as a neutral medical facility. We treated anyone who needed care, regardless of allegiance. Alexander finally looked at her directly, including prisoners from your forces when they were brought to us. The admission struck her like a physical blow. While she had viewed humans as useful only for menial labor, this man had been healing her own soldiers with the same skill he had used to save her life. You could have let me die, she whispered. It would have been justice. Justice isn't about evening scores, it's about doing what's right. Alexander moved closer to the bed, his voice dropping to match her quiet tone. Besides, you trusted me, that mattered. The sincerity in his words made something shift inside her chest. When had anyone spoken to her about right and wrong without political calculation? When had trust been treated as something precious rather than strategic? My empire has enslaved your entire species, she pointed out. Your empire, yes, but you're not your empire. Alexander's hand moved as if to touch her face, then stopped, professional boundaries reasserting themselves. You're someone who chose to trust a stranger rather than die with her prejudices intact. The almost touch sent electricity through Astara's skin. 3 days of intimate medical care had created a tension that grew stronger with each passing hour. She was acutely aware of Alexander's presence, the careful way he maintained proper distance, while his eyes revealed his growing attraction. Commander Typhon believes you're dangerous, she said, testing the waters between them. The question carried layered meaning. Dangerous to her physically? Unlikely. He had proven his intentions through actions. Dangerous to her politically? Possibly. Promoting a human to her personal staff had already generated whispered conversations among her generals. Dangerous to her emotionally? Absolutely. Yes, she admitted, but not in the way he fears. Alexander's breath caught. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that made the air in her chambers feel thick and charged. Astara. Her name on his lips sent heat spiraling through her core. Not your majesty or queen, just her name, spoken with an intimacy that no one else dared. You shouldn't. I know. He moved closer despite his own warning. But these past days, watching you recover, seeing who you are when the crown comes off, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? A conqueror, a tyrant. His hand finally made contact, fingers tracing the line of her jaw with reverent care. Not someone who questions her own assumptions, not someone who values truth over comfort. Astara leaned into his touch, her pulse accelerating as his thumb brushed across her lower lip. The gesture was gentle, exploratory, asking permission rather than taking advantage of her vulnerability. This is madness, she breathed, even as her hand rose to cover his. Probably. You're human, I know what you are. Alexander's voice held quiet conviction. You're the woman who chose to live rather than die for her pride. You're brilliant, strong, and more beautiful than any being has a right to be. The words broke through her last defenses. Astara pulled him down to her, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of desperation and discovery. Alexander's mouth moved against hers with the same careful precision he brought to surgery, learning her responses, adapting to her needs. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Astara saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. How had this happened? How had she gone from viewing him as barely sentient to craving his touch like a physical necessity? There's something you need to know, Alexander said, his voice rough with desire and something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. What? His hand tightened on hers, as if he expected her to pull away from whatever he was about to reveal. I wasn't just a researcher on that hospital ship. I was the chief surgeon, the commanding medical officer. His eyes met hers with painful honesty. My hands have saved hundreds of soldiers who were fighting against your forces. I've treated wounds your weapons caused, held dying men who cursed your name with their last breath. The revelation hit her like cold water. The man she was falling for, the human whose touch set her skin on fire, had spent years undoing the damage her empire inflicted. His skill, his compassion, his very existence had been dedicated to opposing everything she represented. And somehow that made her want him even more. Astara recoiled as if Alexander had struck her. The warmth of their kiss still lingered on her lips, but his revelation turned that intimacy into something that felt like betrayal. She pulled the silk coverings higher, suddenly aware of her vulnerability, in ways that had nothing to do with physical exposure. "Get out," she whispered. Alexander's face went pale. "Astara, please." "I said get out." The command erupted from her with all the authority of someone who had conquered worlds. "How dare you touch me with hands that have worked against my empire? How dare you let me—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "How dare you let me fall for you? How dare you make me question everything I believe? How dare you make me feel weak?" Alexander stepped back, but his eyes held steady determination rather than submission. "You have every right to be angry, but everything I did to save those soldiers, I did to save you too. The same skills, the same knowledge." "Don't," Astara's voice cracked despite her efforts to maintain control. "Don't you dare compare healing my enemies to healing me." "Why? Because it makes you question whether I'm truly your enemy." The question hit too close to the confusion roiling in her chest. 3 days of intimate care, of conversations that revealed his intelligence and compassion, of growing attraction that had culminated in a kiss that still made her pulse race. All of it now felt tainted by deception. The door chimed, interrupting the charged silence. Commander Typhon entered without waiting for permission, his scarred face grim with urgency. "Your Majesty, we have a situation. General Korath has seized control of the outer system defense grid. He's demanding immediate audience." Astara forced herself to focus on the crisis, pushing aside the emotional turmoil Alexander's revelation had created. "On what grounds?" "He claims your incapacitation has compromised imperial security. The Council of Generals is convening to discuss succession protocols." The political implications crashed over her like ice water. Her injury, her recovery time, her visible association with a human, Korath had found the perfect opportunity to challenge her rule. The ambitious general had been circling for years, waiting for any sign of weakness. "Assemble my personal guard," she commanded, rising from the bed despite the lingering tenderness in her shoulder. "Prepare the throne room." "Your Majesty," Typhon's eyes flicked to Alexander, who stood frozen near the medical equipment. "Perhaps it would be wise to distance yourself from certain associations before facing the council." The suggestion hit her like a slap. Hide her connection to the human who had saved her life. Pretend that his medical intervention had been nothing more than convenient timing. Return to the established order where humans knew their place and queens ruled through superior bloodlines. "Your Majesty," Alexander said quietly, "Commander Typhon is right. My presence complicates your political position. I should—" "You should what?" Astara spun to face him, her emotions raw and unfiltered. "Disappear back into slavery? Pretend the last 3 days never happened?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "If that's what it takes to protect your throne, yes." The selflessness in his voice made her chest ache. Even now, even after she had ordered him away in anger, he was thinking of her welfare over his own. When had anyone in her court shown such consideration without calculating personal advantage? The communicator on Typhon's belt crackled to life. "Commander, General Korath's forces have surrounded the medical wing. He's demanding the surrender of any humans with unauthorized access to Her Majesty." Astara's blood turned cold. Korath wasn't just making a political play, he was targeting Alexander specifically. The general had always been vocal about maintaining strict species hierarchies, viewing any deviation as weakness to be eliminated. "How many troops?" Typhon asked. 2 full squads armed for lethal force." Alexander moved toward the door with calm resignation. I'll surrender myself. There's no need for— No. The word exploded from Astara with fierce certainty. The thought of Alexander in Korath's hands, treated as evidence of her weakness and probably executed as an example, sent rage burning through her veins. Your Majesty, Typhon warned, if you protect him now, Korath will use it as proof that you've been compromised by human influence. And if I surrender him, Korath will use his execution as proof that I'm weak enough to abandon those who serve me loyally. Astara's voice carried the steel that had built an empire. Neither option preserves my position. She moved to her weapon storage, selecting the ceremonial blade that had never known defeat. The weight felt good in her hand, familiar and reassuring after days of vulnerability. Then we fight our way out, she decided. Alexander stepped forward, his medical scanner abandoned in favor of an emergency plasma pistol from the wall storage. I can handle myself in combat. You're a surgeon, not a soldier. I'm both. His voice carried quiet confidence. Medical ships in contested space don't survive without armed personnel. I've been in firefights before. The admission shouldn't have surprised her, but it added another layer to the complexity of who Alexander truly was. Healer and warrior, compassionate and pragmatic, human and yet somehow transcending every limitation she had assumed about his species. The service corridors, Typhon said, studying tactical displays on his communicator. We can reach the main hangar bay without encountering Korath's troops. No, Astara said firmly. We go through the throne room. I face the council directly. That's exactly what Korath wants, a public confrontation where he can paint you as compromised. Then I'll show them exactly how compromised I am. Astara's smile held the razor edge that had made generals tremble. Alexander saved my life using skills our medical staff couldn't match. If that's compromise, then perhaps our empire needs more of it. As they prepared to leave her chambers, Alexander caught her arm gently. Astara, you don't have to do this. I knew the risks when I stepped forward in the medical bay. She looked at his hand on her arm, remembering the touch that had healed her, the kiss that had awakened feelings she hadn't known she possessed. 3 days ago, she would have died rather than show weakness. Now she was willing to risk her throne to protect someone who had shown her what strength really looked like. Yes, I do, she said quietly. Because you're not just the human who saved my life. You're the man who made me remember that strength isn't about conquest. It's about choosing what's worth fighting for. Alexander's eyes darkened with emotion. And what are you fighting for? Astara rose on her toes, capturing his lips in a kiss that held all the desperate passion of their earlier embrace, but now waited with choice rather than discovery. When they parted, both breathless, she saw her own determination reflected in his gaze. I'm fighting for us, she whispered, for the possibility that two people from different worlds can create something stronger than either could build alone. The sounds of approaching troops echoed in the corridor outside. Time was running out, but Astara felt more certain of her path than she had in years. Whatever came next, she would face it with Alexander at her side, not as queen and subject, but as equals choosing their own destiny. The throne room doors burst open with a resonance that echoed through the vast chamber. Astara strode through the entrance with Alexander at her right side and Commander Typhon at her left, her ceremonial blade catching the light like captured starfire. The assembled council of generals fell silent, their conversations dying as they took in the unprecedented sight of a human walking as an equal beside their queen. General Korath stood at the center of the room, his imposing frame draped in the full regalia of a military coup. Behind him, 24 armed soldiers maintained formation, their weapons trained on the throne where Astara should have been sitting in vulnerable isolation. Your Majesty, Korath's voice carried mock deference. How fortunate that you've recovered enough to join us, though I question the wisdom of bringing contamination into these sacred chambers. His gaze fixed on Alexander with undisguised hatred. Astara felt rather than saw Alexander's muscles tense, but he maintained the same calm composure he had shown in the medical bay. The only contamination I see, Astara replied, ascending the steps to her throne with deliberate grace, is the stench of treason. Korath's scarred face twisted into a sneer. Treason? I'm protecting the Empire from a queen who has clearly been compromised by human influence. Look at yourself, walking with a slave as if he were your equal, allowing him access to Imperial secrets. This human, Astara's voice rang with absolute authority, saved my life when your precious medical protocols failed. His knowledge and skill preserved the Empire you claim to protect. Exactly my point. Korath gestured dramatically to the assembled generals. You've become dependent on inferior beings. Your judgment has been clouded by proximity to primitives. Alexander stepped forward, his movement fluid and confident despite the weapons pointed at him. General Korath, perhaps you'd like to test those assumptions about human capabilities? The challenge hung in the air like an electric charge. Astara's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had seen Alexander's hands work with surgical precision, witnessed his mind analyze complex problems with methodical brilliance. Now she was about to discover what those qualities meant in combat. You dare challenge me, slave? Korath's hand moved to his sidearm. I challenge your premise, Alexander replied calmly. You claim humans are inferior. I propose a demonstration. What happened next unfolded with the breathtaking speed of controlled violence. Korath drew his weapon, but Alexander was already moving. The human's combat training revealed itself in economical motions that spoke of extensive experience under fire. He rolled beneath Korath's aim, came up inside the general's guard, and delivered a precise strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. Korath dropped like a felled tree, his weapon clattering across the polished floor. The throne room erupted in chaos. Korath's soldiers raised their weapons, but found themselves facing not just Alexander but Commander Typhon and the royal guard who had positioned themselves during the distraction. The standoff lasted precisely 3 seconds before the nearest general called for his troops to stand down. Impressive reflexes for a primitive, General Voss observed dryly. Perhaps our intelligence assessments require updating. Astara descended from her throne, moving to where Korath lay unconscious on the floor. She retrieved his weapon, checking the charge with professional interest, before looking up at the assembled council. General Korath has demonstrated why his judgment is inadequate for leadership, she announced. He allowed preconceptions to blind him to reality, a failing I will not tolerate in my command structure. She gestured to Alexander, who stood ready for further threats despite being vastly outnumbered. This human possesses medical knowledge that saved my life, tactical awareness that neutralized a superior opponent, and the courage to risk everything for what he believes is right. These are the qualities I value in my closest advisors. General Voss stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Your Majesty, assuming we accept this revision of human capabilities, what are you proposing? Astara moved to stand beside Alexander, close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact sent familiar electricity through her, but now it carried the weight of public declaration. I'm proposing that our empire has succeeded through adaptation and growth. When we encounter superior technology, we integrate it. When we find effective tactics, we adopt them. When we discover valuable allies. She turned to face Alexander, her voice dropping to intimate warmth despite the public setting. We bind them to us through partnership rather than slavery. Alexander's eyes widened as he understood what she was offering. Not just freedom, not just a position in her court, but something far more significant. Astara, he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. Alexander Cross, she said, her voice carrying formal weight. I offer you a choice. Return to Earth with a ship and supplies, or remain here as my partner in reshaping this empire. The throne room held collective breath as Alexander considered her words. Partnership with an alien queen meant abandoning any hope of returning to human space, accepting a life among beings who had enslaved his species. But it also meant the chance to build something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that could transform everything. I accept, he said simply. Astara's smile held more warmth than any star. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with perfect fit, despite the differences in their origins. Then let me make this official, she announced, turning back to the council. I hereby appoint Alexander Cross as royal consort and chief medical advisor. His word carries the weight of my authority in matters of health and human integration." The political implications sent ripples through the assembled generals, but Astara watched their faces carefully. Ambition, yes, but also curiosity. The human had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded their estimates, and several were clearly reconsidering their assumptions about Earth's conquered population. "Furthermore," she continued, "I'm establishing a new protocol for human personnel. Those who demonstrate exceptional abilities will be offered advancement based on merit rather than species." It was a revolutionary concept that would reshape her empire's foundation, but Alexander's presence beside her made it feel not just possible, but inevitable. "Your Majesty," General Voss said carefully, "this will require significant restructuring of our colonial policies." "Then we restructure." Astara's voice carried the absolute certainty that had built her empire. Strength comes from utilizing every advantage, not from clinging to outdated prejudices. Later, in the privacy of her chambers, Astara found herself pressed against Alexander's chest as he traced the scar where the toxin had nearly ended her life. His touch held reverence, as if he were mapping something precious rather than examining healed tissue. "No regrets?" she asked, her voice soft against his throat. "Only one," Alexander murmured, his hands tangling in her hair, "that it took a poison weapon to bring us together." Astara laughed, the sound rich with contentment she had never thought possible. Perhaps the best discoveries require the greatest risks. Then I'm looking forward to what we discover next. As Alexander's lips found hers in a kiss that tasted of new beginnings, Astara realized that conquering worlds had never felt as triumphant as this moment of choosing love over fear, partnership over dominion, and a future built together rather than apart. Outside her windows, the stars that had once represented territories to claim now seemed like infinite possibilities waiting to be explored, not as a conqueror and her subjects, but as partners writing their own destiny across the galaxy.